Hi everyone. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 36 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I never in my life thought I would be the woman sitting in a lawyer's office with a box of printed screenshots and a calm expression on my face. But here's the thing about being betrayed slowly, and I mean slowly over years, is that by the time you finally decide to do something about it, you're not hysterical anymore. You're not crying. You're not even angry in the way most people would expect. You're just quiet. And quiet, I learned, is the most dangerous thing a woman can be. So let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you how my husband of 9 years spent 3 of those years lying to my face, building a second life, 40 minutes away from the home we shared together. The home that was, legally, entirely in my name. He didn't know that part, not until it was too late. And honestly, if you've ever had a gut feeling about someone you loved and talked yourself out of it because you were too scared to be right, you already know exactly where this story is going. I want to start at the beginning because I think the beginning matters. I think it explains why I did what I did and why, even now, I don't regret a single step of it. Marcus and I met when I was 25 and he was 25 and he was 28. He was charming in that easy, unremarkable way. Not flashy, not dramatic. Just warm. He remembered your coffee order after one visit. He held doors and asked follow-up questions and laughed at his own jokes in this slightly embarrassed way that made everyone around him feel comfortable. I fell for all of it. We dated for 2 years, got engaged at a vineyard in Virginia where he gave a little speech that made my mother cry, and then we got married in the backyard of my grandparents' house in Dayton on a Saturday afternoon in September. It was simple, it was ours. I genuinely believed I had chosen well. The first few years were good. Not perfect. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not going to stand here and pretend we had some fairy tale and then it all went wrong. We had arguments. We had long stretches of distance where we'd sit in the same room and barely speak. But we also had Sunday mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles, and trips to his sister's place in Nashville where we'd stay up too late playing board games and laughing until we couldn't breathe. We had real things. Real moments. The house became ours in 2018. Except, and this is the part that matters, it didn't exactly become ours. It became mine. Here's the backstory on that. My grandmother passed away in early 2017 and left me a significant inheritance. Not life-changing, but meaningful. Around $140,000. My parents and my grandmother had always been careful, deliberate people, and part of the conversation my grandmother had with my mother before she passed was about protecting assets within the family. My mother sat me down before the money was transferred and said, very plainly, "Nora, this money is yours. Not yours and Marcus's. Yours. If you use it to buy a home, put it in your name. You can add him later if you want. But start with your name." I remember feeling slightly defensive when she said that. Marcus and I were solid, I thought. We were happy. The idea of protecting myself from my own husband felt almost insulting. But my mother had watched 3 of her friends go through divorces, and she had a very particular expression on her face when she said it. Not suspicious, just knowing. So I listened. We used the inheritance as a down payment on a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb of Columbus. The mortgage was in my name. The deed was in my name. Marcus contributed to the household expenses, the groceries, the utilities. But legally, structurally, the house was mine. Marcus knew this at the time. We had conversations about it. He said he understood. He said he understood. He said it made sense. He said we'd sort out adding him to the deed once the mortgage was more settled. We never sorted it out. I forgot about it entirely. He apparently forgot about it too. That was his first mistake. The first sign was so small, I'm almost embarrassed to say it out loud. It was a Wednesday in the spring of 2021. Marcus had told me he had a work dinner, client relations, something about a quarterly review. And I'd made peace with eating alone, which I'd gotten used to by then. He was in sales management and his schedule had always been inconsistent. I fell asleep on the couch waiting for him and woke up at midnight. He wasn't home. I texted him and he replied 11 minutes later, just, "Still with clients. Don't wait up." And I didn't think much of it, not then. But something about the 11-minute gap sat with me. Marcus always had his phone on him. Always. He was the kind of person who responded to texts within seconds. Even from across a crowded room. 11 minutes wasn't long, but it was long for him. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went to bed. Then it happened again 3 weeks later. And again a month after that. Not the late nights specifically, but the small strange things. A slight shift in the way he smelled when he came home. Not cologne exactly. Just something different. Something soft. The way he started showering immediately when he got in. Before dinner, before sitting down, before anything. The way his phone screen had started facing down on the kitchen counter when it used to face up. The way he'd become slightly kinder in a way that felt compensatory rather than genuine. Bringing home flowers twice in a month after years of never buying them at all. I want to pause here and ask you something because I think about this a lot. How do you know when a gut feeling is real versus when it's just anxiety or insecurity talking? How do you trust yourself when the evidence is this soft, this circumstantial? I had no proof. I had flowers and a delayed text and a faint shift in atmosphere. That's nothing. That's paranoia dressed up as intuition. Drop a comment below if you've ever been in that place, where you knew something was wrong but you couldn't prove it yet, because it's one of the loneliest feelings in the world. I pushed it down. For months, I pushed it down. I told myself I was projecting, that I was anxious, that our marriage had just entered a quiet phase and I was inventing drama to fill the silence. I made excuses for him with a dedication that I now find genuinely heartbreaking. The second crack came in July. I was looking for our car insurance documents in his home office. He kept all the physical paperwork in a filing cabinet. And while I was searching, I found a credit card statement I didn't recognize. The card was in Marcus's name, but it wasn't linked to any of our joint accounts. It had charges on it I couldn't place. A hotel in Cincinnati. A restaurant in Dublin, Ohio. A jeweler I'd never heard of. I stood in that office for a long time with that statement in my hands, and then I put it back exactly where I found it. Filed it away under nothing, noted its position, and walked out of the room. Because I had made a decision, standing there. I wasn't going to react. I was going to watch. I want to be careful here about how much I explain, because what followed over the next 3 months was not something I'm entirely proud of in terms of methods. I became methodical in a way I didn't know I was capable of. Organized. Patient. Almost clinical. I started with what I could access openly. I went through our shared cloud backup, the one we'd set up together for phone photos years ago and never really managed, and found that Marcus had auto backup enabled on his phone. He'd never turned it off. Neither had I. It was just sitting there, quietly syncing. I found photos. Not many. He was careful, mostly, but enough. Enough to know that this wasn't a one-time mistake. There was a woman. Her name, as I would eventually learn, was Dana. She was 31. She worked in marketing at a firm downtown. She was pretty in a neat, put-together way that felt like a studied contrast to my own loose, tired edges. In the photos, she looked happy. They both did. I sat with my laptop open in our bedroom, on the bed we shared, with my husband downstairs watching television. And I looked at those photos for a very long time. And then I closed the laptop and went downstairs and asked him if he wanted popcorn. Sure, he said, not looking up. The light butter ones in the cabinet. I made the popcorn. I sat beside him. I watched whatever he was watching, and I felt myself become someone I hadn't been before, someone with a separate, carefully guarded interior, a place where I was keeping everything I knew. Over the next 8 weeks, I documented everything I could access ethically and legally. I printed the cloud photos. I printed the credit card statements I photographed with my phone when he was out. I noted dates and cross-referenced them against what he told me he was doing. The hotel in Cincinnati. That was the weekend he told me he was at a work conference. The jeweler charge. That was the same week he forgot our anniversary entirely and said he'd been slammed at work. I wasn't building a revenge plan. I wasn't thinking about the house yet. I was just building a record because it felt better than doing nothing. It felt like the only form of agency I had. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Webb. She came recommended by a colleague of mine. Quietly, the way these recommendations always happen, passed like a note in a hallway. I met her on a Tuesday morning while Marcus thought I was at a dentist appointment. She had a small office near the short north, framed degrees on the walls, and a directness I found immediately comforting. "Tell me about the property," she said, after I'd explained the basics. So I did. I told her about the inheritance, about my mother's advice, about the deed and the mortgage, and the fact that in 9 years we had never formally added Marcus to either. She listened without expression, made notes, and then she looked up at me. "The house is yours, Nora. Entirely. He has no legal claim to it in a divorce, not in Ohio, not if it was funded by inheritance and titled solely in your name, and not if you can demonstrate the mortgage payments came from your income and the down payment was an inheritance." I stared at her for a second. "He thinks it's ours," I said. "That's not a legal argument," she said. "That's an assumption." I still can't explain what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief. It was something colder and much more focused. Like a key turning in a lock. Here's what I did not do. I did not confront Marcus. I did not cry at him. I did not scroll through his phone with trembling hands and scream about Dana. I did not give him a single reason to get defensive, get lawyered up, or get strategic. I gave him absolutely nothing. What I did instead was perform my marriage with the focus and consistency of someone who had decided their own future was worth protecting. I want to be honest about how hard that was. There were nights where he'd reach for my hand on the couch, and I'd have to physically regulate my own breathing not to pull away. There were Sunday mornings where he'd be cheerful and domestic, making eggs, humming something, and I'd sit at the kitchen island watching him and thinking about the hotel receipt from Cincinnati and wondering what version of himself he was performing for me. I started moving my personal savings incrementally. Nothing dramatic, nothing he'd notice. Small transfers to an account he didn't have visibility into, a process Patricia had told me to begin immediately. I paid down a portion of the mortgage, which technically increased my own equity. I was careful. I was slow. I never moved so much at once that it would register as strange. Marcus, during all of this, was in his own world. In retrospect, I think he was starting to pull back. Not obviously, he was never cruel or cold in the direct ways that would have been easier to name. But there was a gradual withdrawal, a slight thinning of his presence in the house. He started going to the gym on Saturday mornings. He started taking more overnight work trips. He started using a second phone. I discovered it almost by accident, saw it charging in his car when I grabbed his keys for something. A cheap prepaid thing tucked under the seat. I took a photo of it with my phone and said nothing. I think on some level he was preparing too. Testing the waters of a life without me. Building confidence in an exit. He didn't know I was already 3 steps ahead of him on the way out. He thought the house was his. He thought our savings were joint. He thought 9 years of marriage meant half of everything we've built together. He thought a lot of things. There was one conversation in the fall October, I think. The leaves had just started turning, where he came home quieter than usual and sat across from me at the dinner table with this expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone rehearsing something. "Are you happy?" he asked me. I looked up from my plate. I kept my voice completely level. "Are you?" I said. He looked back down at his food. He didn't answer. And we ate the rest of dinner in silence, and I refilled his water glass, and later he watched the news and I read in the bedroom, and that was that. That was October. He filed for divorce in February. Between October and February, I had 6 more meetings with Patricia. We went through everything methodically. She had seen cases like mine. Not identical, but close enough. A wife who had quietly protected assets, who had inheritance documentation, who had a clean paper trail showing that the marital home was funded entirely by premarital inheritance and titled solely in her name. He will argue marital contribution, Patricia told me. He's been living there for 5 years, paying utilities, contributing to household expenses. His attorney will argue that entitles him to some equity. Does it? I asked. It's a factor. It won't be nothing. But it's not going to give him half the house. Not with what you have documented. She paused, reviewing her notes. The affair documentation, how solid is it? Very, I said. I opened my folder. 3 months of printed documentation, time-stamped, organized by date. Photos from the cloud backup. The credit card statements. A note from a private investigator I'd hired for 2 weeks. Patricia's suggestion. Done carefully. All above board. The investigator had photographed Marcus and Dana together at a restaurant and her apartment complex, leaving together in his car on 3 separate occasions. Patricia looked through the folder without hurrying. Then she set it down. Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, she said. But this matters for asset division arguments. It speaks to the overall picture of the marriage and his conduct. She straightened the folder and handed it back to me. You've done good work, Nora. There was a strange feeling in that moment. Not pride exactly. More like the satisfaction of completing something I hadn't even known I was capable of. I was a graphic designer. I managed branding projects for small businesses. I was not someone who organized evidence. I was not someone who hired investigators or read property law summaries late at night. But I had become her. Out of necessity, I suppose. Out of the particular clarity that comes when someone you love hollows out the thing you built together, and you realize the only person protecting you is you. And here's the part that I want you to really sit with, because I think about this every single time I tell this story. He was about to file. He was planning it. I could feel it in the house, that particular tension of someone making up their mind. And he had absolutely no idea I was ready. He served me on a Thursday. I remember the exact moment, because I was sitting in the driveway when the process server knocked on the car window, having just pulled in from a client meeting. I took the envelope. I read the documents inside. And then I sat there for maybe 15 minutes, watching the neighbor's kid ride a bicycle up and down the sidewalk in the gray February afternoon. Marcus had cited irreconcilable differences. Clean, neutral, nothing inflammatory. His attorney's paperwork was organized and professional. He was requesting an equitable division of marital property, including the primary residence and all joint savings and investment accounts. It was written as though it was already a settled thing. As though half the house was already factored in. He texted me that evening. He said he was sorry for how things had ended, and that he hoped we could handle things maturely. He said he would be staying with a friend and that I shouldn't worry about the house in the short term. I know this is a shock, he wrote. I'm sorry. I read the message twice. I typed back. I've already contacted my attorney. That was it. That was all I sent. I called Patricia that night and told her the papers had been served. She was unsurprised. We had anticipated this. Everything that followed had been planned for months. My counterclaim was already drafted. The documentation was already organized. The only thing left was to let it play out in court. In the weeks that followed, there was a back and forth between our attorneys that I was largely sheltered from. I got summaries. Marcus's team was pushing hard on the house. It was their primary asset argument. They were confident, from what Patricia communicated back to me, that we'd settle with him receiving somewhere between 30% and 40% of the home's value. They had an appraiser. They had a number. They were already spending money he didn't have yet. I imagine he told Dana. I imagine they had plans. The thought didn't make me as angry as you might expect. By that point I had been living with the knowledge of his betrayal for the better part of a year. Anger had long since burned itself out and left behind something much steadier. I just wanted it done. The hearing was on a Tuesday in April. The trees were just starting to bloom. I want to describe the courtroom moment carefully because I know it's what most people listening to this are waiting for. And I don't want to rush it. It deserves its full weight. The room was small, not like the dramatic courtrooms on television. It was a family law hearing room, fluorescent lighting, wood-paneled walls. A judge named the Honorable Christine Abler, who had short gray hair and the patient expression of someone who had heard every version of every story twice. Marcus sat on the other side of the aisle with his attorney, a tall man with a very confident posture, who kept crossing and uncrossing his arms. Marcus was in a gray suit. He looked tired. He looked for the first time in a long time, like he was not entirely in control of something. His attorney opened by laying out their case for the house. He was articulate and calm. He argued marital contribution, the years of shared living expenses, the maintenance Marcus had performed, the emotional and financial investment of a spouse who had built his life in this home. He used the word equitable several times. He presented their appraised value, $387,000. He argued that Marcus was entitled to no less than one-third. Then Patricia stood up. She presented the deed. She presented the deed. She presented the original mortgage documents from 2018. She presented the inheritance documentation, my grandmother's estate records, the transfer of funds, the paper trail showing precisely where the down payment came from. She presented 5 years of mortgage statements, showing payments made entirely from my individual income account, not from any joint account. She presented the county property records showing that in 9 years of marriage, the title had never been amended, never been jointly filed, never been altered in any legal way. She was very calm, very organized. She did not editorialize. She just laid down the documents one by one like cards on a table. I watched Marcus's attorney's posture change over the course of about 10 minutes. The crossed arms stopped. He leaned forward. He started writing on his legal pad. I could see Marcus lean toward him and whisper something, and I could see his attorney respond without looking up, still writing, and Marcus sit back. Then Patricia added the final piece. She presented Patricia's documentation of the affair, not to punish Marcus in a personal sense, but as evidence of the conduct and context of the marriage's dissolution. The investigator's photographs. The credit card statements. The timeline. She noted, plainly, that Marcus had been maintaining a parallel relationship for an estimated 3 years, that he had used marital finances to fund that relationship, and that his claim to equitable treatment needed to be considered in the full light of the marital history. The judge had been writing notes throughout. Now she looked up at Marcus's attorney. Counsel, does your client dispute the title documentation presented by the petitioner? A pause. No, Your Honor. We do not dispute the title. And does your client dispute the inheritance origin of the down payment? No, Your Honor. Then the primary residence is not a marital asset, subject to division. It was funded by separate property, titled solely in the petitioner's name, and there is no documentation of conversion to marital property at any point during the marriage. She made a note. She moved on. Just like that. I didn't look at Marcus. I kept my eyes forward. But Patricia touched my arm once under the table, just a brief, quiet touch, and I understood what it meant. I've thought about what I would have felt if I'd confronted him back when I first found those photos. If I'd screamed and cried and thrown things and given him the chance to get defensive and lawyer up and get strategic before I was ready, I think I would have lost. I think he would have gotten that house, and I think I would have spent years afterward replaying every decision I made in panic instead of in clarity. Waiting was the hardest thing I have ever done. And it was the right thing. Completely, absolutely the right thing. The divorce was finalized in July. It took about 4 months from the hearing. In the end, Marcus received a portion of our joint savings account. That was genuinely shared money, and I had no argument against dividing it. He received his car, his personal belongings, his retirement account contributions from his own employment. He received a fair portion of the things that were actually ours together. He did not receive the house. I know he told people I was cold. I know he told his family I had set him up somehow, that I'd been calculating and manipulative and that he never had a fair chance. I heard this secondhand, through his sister, who was kind enough to tell me, I think because she didn't entirely disagree with what I'd done. His framing was that I'd weaponized legal technicalities against him. I've thought about that framing a lot, because from a certain angle it's not entirely wrong. I did use what I knew to protect myself. I did move deliberately and strategically. I did let him believe things that weren't true about his own position. But here is what I keep coming back to. He spent 3 years lying to my face. He spent 3 years building a life with someone else while sleeping in my house, eating at my table, telling me he loved me when I asked. He planned to walk out of our marriage and take as much with him as he could carry. He was not a passive victim of my strategy. He was the architect of a situation that required me to have one. Dana, as far as I know, did not end up being his great love story. I heard from a mutual friend about 8 months after the divorce was finalized that they had broken up. I don't know the details, and honestly I don't want them. That's not my chapter anymore. I stayed in the house through the winter. I repainted the bedroom, a deep blue-green that Marcus would have hated. I got a dog, a 3-year-old rescue named Howard, who takes up most of the couch and has strong opinions about the television schedule. I started working from home full-time, which I'd wanted to do for years and never had the space to properly commit to while living someone else's version of our life. My mother called me the week after the divorce was finalized. She didn't say I told you so. She's not that kind of woman. She just said, "Are you okay?" And I thought about it honestly for a second. Really sat with it. "Yeah," I said. "I actually am." And she exhaled this long, quiet breath and said, "Good. Come for dinner Sunday." I went. We had pot roast. Howard sat on her feet the entire evening and she pretended to be annoyed about it while feeding him scraps under the table. It was the best Sunday I'd had in years. I've been asked a few times, by people who know parts of this story, whether I feel guilty, whether I wish I had done something differently, whether the way I handled it, the patience, the planning, the quiet accumulation of evidence, whether any of it crossed a line. And my honest answer is no, not because I'm someone without a conscience. I'm not. There were nights during those months of watching and waiting where what I was doing felt unbearable. There were moments where I wanted to collapse the whole thing, just confront him, just have the screaming fight, just let it be over. The performance of normalcy was exhausting in a way I don't fully have words for. You cannot explain to someone who hasn't done it what it costs to sit across from someone who is betraying you and hand them a cup of coffee and ask about their day. But I also know what I was protecting. I was protecting the house my grandmother's love built. I was protecting the financial stability that had taken me my whole adult life to build. I was protecting myself from a version of this story where I came out with nothing because I reacted instead of acted. And I know, that if I hadn't been careful, that would have been the version. Marcus wasn't cruel, but he wasn't going to volunteer fairness. Nobody does when there's money involved. So I did what I had to do. Quietly, legally, completely within my rights. And I walked out of that courtroom with my house intact, and my name on the deed, and a dog waiting at home, and a mother who would have pot roast ready on Sunday. If you're listening to this and you're in something that feels wrong, if you're carrying a gut feeling that you keep talking yourself out of, I want you to hear me when I say this. Trust yourself. Don't react in panic. Get informed. Get documentation. Talk to someone who can actually help you, not just someone who will validate your worst fears. Protect yourself with the same energy you've been spending protecting the person who is hurting you. You are allowed to be strategic about your own life. That's not manipulation, that's survival. And sometimes survival looks like sitting quietly across a courtroom while the judge reads a deed and your husband's attorney stops crossing his arms. Sometimes it looks like exactly that. If this story hit close to home for you, leave a comment. I read every single one. And I genuinely want to know what you took from this. And if you know someone going through something like this, share it. You never know who needs to hear that being quiet doesn't mean being powerless. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.